Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog Solo. And as you hear the classic intro, that now indicates that it's just me, and I'm not doing an explainer necessarily. However, today is a little bit between a rant and an explanation. I've been thinking about what people need to understand about the way we use common words, ones that are thrown around, and radical politics that have deeper, longer origins, and that their etymology, that is their history, is kind of occluded in the way we use them today, but also that there is a relationship between them. Now, it is fallacious to assume that the real meaning is just the historical one, but I think we do have to admit that there's a history to these terms, that they inform how we think by limiting the frameworks that we apply to thinking. Here at Varnblog, this is a pedagogical project. It aims to put theory and praxis into alignment through pedagogy. But to understand that, all right, we have to understand what theory, praxis, and poesis is. All these words come from the ancient Greek. And in fact, the triumvirate there, theoria, praxis, poesis, what we might call in English theory, practice, or process, and praxis means both, which is part of the problem with translating it. And poesis or poetics is actually too narrow for its Greek sense. Poesis means to make. Theoria is different from philosophia in some key ways. And it's important that we go back and look at these words and their origins, because those classical origins were picked up in both English and German context in the 18th and 19th century and brought into the discussion. They have long traditions, and you do need to know them. And this is one of the problems with people not knowing classical learning. Yes, these are the deadest white men, and in some ways we need to also admit they weren't really white by our standards today, although they were men. It is always weird to me that people refer to the Greek culture of the Levant, North Africa, Western Asia, and Southern Europe as white, because it was picked up in part of the racial narratives of German thinking to oppose the English in the 18th and 19th century. Now, that's me explaining how that happened is beyond the scope of this one short video. But if you want me to go into it, I can. There's a reason why you always read neoclassical British stuff as tying back to Rome, even in the way they justify the crown. And in the post-German idealist and German romantic world of the 18th and 19th century, as part of the project of German unification itself, Greek thought is revitalized. Now, Greek thought is also super important to Christian theology, so you can't just say that it wasn't part of the Christian and even Islamic world prior to the 18th and 19th century, but it being seen as the beginnings of Europeanness is sort of a post-Enlightenment project. But that's neither here nor there. It's just crucial to know about how the religious connotation got removed from these words. And they even had religious connotations in many ways in their original ancient philosophical context. And again, you're going to have to trust me on that. It's several books worth of material for me to explain that in detail. But very few of the ancient philosophers actually thought of themselves as not having theological and spiritual concerns. The Epicureans kind of have what we might call spiritual concerns in the same way that like Buddhists have spiritual concerns, but they didn't have theology. And the Cynics, for the most part, didn't have theology, but all the other groups, including the Stoics, the 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 Socratic academics, the Neoplatonists, the Middle Platonists, etc., had esoteric religious teachings. So these words are tied into that framework. Now that we use them in radical politics is because they are part of the reference set for Marx and Engels, and every classically educated German in the 19th century and into the early 20th. You can thank German idealism for that, and that's neither a critique nor a boon. It's just something you have to note. So let me go into these a little bit. What is theory for? To understand what theory is for, we have to go into what theory is. I'm going to do a pedagogy last, and I feel like I'm going to spend a whole lot of time today going into Greek words. But the first three concepts we're going to deal with really do come from Aristotle's conception. And you will find that even our conceptions of science, categories, biology, for both good and ill, have a continuity to Aristotle in either acceptance of things like necessities and consequences, or rejections, such as moving away from uh, early modern notions of Aristotelian biology to more modern notions, moving away from types and subtypes into species and evolutions, etc. Now, one thing to note that Theoria does not mean philosophy. Sophia means wisdom. It's different from episte, which is more knowledge. Um, you may recognize episte from epistemology or the philosophical study of knowledge. Wisdom is a broader concept. All right, and philos means love, so lover of wisdom, as opposed to, say, sophists, who are also wisdomists, really. Now, philosophy entered English actually from the French in about 1170. That's at least our earliest written attestation to it. And by that point, it actually means basically the advanced study of four things: logic, ethics, physics, and metaphysics, which was tied into practice. All right, so praxis and theoria are both contained in philosophy. To love wisdom is to not just know it, but it is also to practice it. Now, by the time you get to Marx, and we're jumping ahead like 1,000 years for even when the term enters English, we have a critique of philosophy as insufficient, that it is not related to praxis, that it's related to contemplation. It is pure theoria. All right, pure theory. Now, theoria actually is a term that is used in a lot of Christian mysticism, which I think is often missed. And in fact, in Christian mysticism, and particularly in medieval Catholic and in Eastern Orthodox thought, theoria or contemplatio, which I'm probably butchering, means to look at or to gaze at. The word theory comes from theorein, to consider, to speculate, to look at, and it has all three connotations. It is the verb form of theoros, which means spectator, viewer, seer. All right. So theory does not mean, in the both classical Christian and in the Aristotelian sense, does not mean just thinking. It means to think in a way that it both clarifies your vision and reinforces it. To see the world as if one sees God, or in the case of the Aristotelian conception, to see the world as if it is unveiled to you. So theory is about seeing, it's about new ways of seeing. And we might forget that when we look at the modern use of theory, like theory as speculation or theory as scientific theory. Because scientific theory, for example, is more or less a fact. And we're gonna have to get into facticity later. We'll come. This might be its own solo series, right? But this is not part of nailing it down because this is a little bit broader than I would normally want to approach. So to see engage in theory is to come up with a way to know the world for what it is. If you think of mysticism, right, which is things that are concealed, Theoria is the thing that the initiate has to see what is concealed. And you can see this even in modern uses, Marxist uses of theory. You can look at like Horkheimer Adorno's critical theory. They're using Hegelian dialectics to see what is concealed in history and political economy. All right. And the Leninists will use it the same way. Why do we have theory? To unveil the ideologies of the modes of production. Now, that is more specific than what is meant in this ancient form, but you can see a direct correlation. What theory is for is to see more clearly. But you have to ask yourself, whenever you engage in theory, what are you actually seeing more clearly? The for what and the to whom is vital when you're engaging in this. Absolutely vital. If you have a specific notion of God to which your theory is showing you, that's going to be informing you in a feedback loop on what you could see. Now, in some ways, for example, we can even see etymological roots with theory with like Indian words from like Hinduism, like darsana or darshan. All right. And there are many scholars, Ian Rutherford, Gregory Grieve, Richard Seaford, and I do believe Thomas McEvely, who all focus on this. But it's important to see what theory is about and why it is different from philosophy. Why do Marxists engage in theory and not pure philosophy? Is theory is about seeing so you can practice it. Now, you can read someone like Pierre Hadot to get a very accurate view of the way like ancient Greeks saw what philosophy was for. The distinction between philosophy and religion is a modern distinction. And it's one that really only kind of makes sense in Abrahamic religions anyway, where belief is dogmatically held to, and belief is actually separated from practice, both political practice and personal practice. So belief actually takes a more important view than, say, the law, even in actually Judaism and Islam, um, and the virtues in Judaism and Islam. So, for example, if you think about the role of hadith in Islam, hadith are stories about the Prophet, which is where a lot of the rules of Islamic behavior come from. What are they about? Well, to be a virtuous Muslim is to forego the model of the Prophet. And the hadith is how you know the model, which is why if you go read the Quran, you're not going to find most of the rules that govern Islamic law. They come from the Hadith, the virtues as espoused by the Prophet. Similarly, if you're a non-monastic Buddhist, you're not going to be given a lot of rules. There's a Vinaya. There are the you know the Eightfold Path, which has ethical correspondence. But what you're going to see is list of like right behavior, but those are rarely ever rules. In fact, often they're explicitly not rules. The ones that are rules are like don't take intoxicants, and even that sort of debated as what it means. Um, what you are given instead is like Jakarta tales and hagiographies of bodhisattvas, saints, and arhats, and things to model. So you contemplate what it means to live a good life in the ancient way of thinking by practicing what you see. The focus on belief is one thing, and the focus on rules and another is actually pretty specifically Abrahamic, and the focus on orthodox belief about those rules is pretty specifically Christian. All that is contained in our modern secular uses of theoria, of theory. Theory is not just philosophy in some way that is both more limited and broader. We use theory to change the world because we see the world differently and thus can change it. Now, the next one in this series is going to be on praxis in this Aristotlean trilogy that still shows up in Marxism. And then we'll talk about poiesis too. I'm going to consider these solos. I admit this is almost an explainer, but you'll get to what I'm building towards in this series, in this specific series, if you watch this. And there's going to be a lot of ancient history involved where I try to get into and build to how we got to using these terms the way we do today in quote Western culture unquote. And I'm going to try as best as I can to show other examples in ancient cultures that are not white or Western to illustrate to you that these patterns of thought are not universal. I mean, these frameworks are like what the virtues are, how people frame them, even how people parse categories is radically different from culture to culture. But the tendency to do things this way is not so much. All right. I hope you find this clarifying, even if it is kind of classical education. Be back in a few with a discussion on praxis.